You could smell it before you saw anything. The second the door opened, it hit you, and it hit you everywhere at once. Fresh ground coffee, not from a machine in a Starbucks, from a huge red grinder at the front of the store that was taller than you were when you were 7 years old. Your mother handed the red bag of whole beans to the cashier. The cashier poured them in, and the machine roared to life. The entire store was filled with a smell so deep and so warm that 50 years later you can close your eyes right now and it is there. That was the A&P, the store where your mother bought everything. The store where America bought everything. 15,000 locations in 39 states, bigger than Walmart and Sears and Kroger and all of them. For 60 years, it was the largest grocery store in the country, and for a while it was the largest retailer of any kind on earth. The Wall Street Journal called it the Walmart of its time. Time magazine said going to the A&P was an American tribal rite. And now it is gone. Every single store, every single one, closed in 2015 after 156 years. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. You went with your mother, that is how it started for everybody. You held her hand in the parking lot and the doors opened, and the first thing was the coffee. Always the coffee. 8 o'clock coffee in the red bag, Bocar in the black bag, red circle in the yellow bag. The grinder was near the front, sometimes right at the checkout, and when someone had their beans ground, the whole store changed. The smell got into the walls and the ceiling and the wooden floors, and it never left. People who worked at A&P said they could smell it in their clothes when they got home at night, and they never minded because it was the best smell in the world. You remember the floors. Some of the older stores had wooden floors, and in certain sections there was sawdust on them, which you thought was the most interesting thing you had ever seen in a grocery store. You remember the butcher counter in the back where a man in a white coat and a white hat cut meat right in front of you and wrapped it in paper. Your mother told him what she wanted. He knew her name because she came every week, and he always gave you a slice of bologna when she was not looking. You remember Ann and Page. You might not remember it as a brand name, but if I say it, you can see the label. Ann Page macaroni, Ann Page peanut butter, Ann Page ketchup. The store brand that was in every cabinet in your mother's kitchen because it cost less than the national brands, and your mother said it tasted exactly the same, and she was right. You remember Jane Parker bread, Jane Parker donuts. That cinnamon bread with the big swirls was absolutely incredible when you put it in the toaster and the butter melted into the cinnamon and the whole kitchen smelled like Sunday morning. You remember the first time your mother sent you in alone. You were maybe 10 or 11. She gave you a list written on the back of an envelope and some folded bills and said, "Get exactly what is on the list and do not buy anything else and bring back the change." And you walked into that store by yourself for the first time and you felt like the important person in the world. You found every item. You put them on the counter. The cashier rang them up on one of those big mechanical registers that made a sound every time she hit a key, and the drawer popped open with a bell, and she counted your change back into your hand 1 coin at a time, the way people used to do it, out loud so you could follow along. And you walked out of that store carrying 2 brown paper bags, and you had never been more proud of anything in your life. That was the A&P, not a supermarket, a place where you learned how the adult world worked, how money worked, how choosing between 2 brands worked, how talking to the butcher worked, how carrying something heavy without dropping it worked. Half the people watching this right now learned how to count change at an A&P checkout counter, and half the people watching this right now can still hear the sound of that register if they close their eyes. The mechanical clack of each key, the bell when the drawer opened, the rustle of the paper bag, the voice of the cashier counting it back, $25, $50, $75, $1. Now, here is what most people do not know about this company. The A&P was not always a grocery store. It started as a tea shop. In 1859, a man named George Gilman opened a small store on Vesey Street in downtown Manhattan selling tea and coffee he imported directly from the ships coming into New York Harbor. He cut out the middleman and sold it cheaper than anyone else. His stores were something to see: bright red walls, crystal chandeliers, tin ceilings, Chinese wall panels, clerks in uniforms standing behind long counters. It looked nothing like a grocery store and everything like a place you wanted to be. In 1869, he renamed the company the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company to honor the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad and because it sounded grand and ambitious and slightly impossible, which is exactly what it was. But the man who actually built the empire was not Gilman. It was his employee. George Huntington Hartford started as a clerk and worked his way up to running the entire operation. When Gilman died without a will in 1901, Hartford took control. But the real story is his sons, two brothers named George and John, who could not have been more different from each other if they had tried. George was the older one, quiet, heavy-set, so shy that most employees never laid eyes on him in their entire career. A journalist who met him said he could be taken for a retired Polish general. His hobbies were repairing cars and building crystal radios, activities that required him to say almost nothing to anyone. He ran the money, he watched the numbers, he sat and he listened. John was the opposite in every way. Thin, quick, charming, full of jokes, a showman who lived in a Tudor mansion with a 9-hole golf course and a polo field, and who kept a suite at the Plaza Hotel and wintered at the Breakers in Palm Beach. He was married 3 times, twice to the same woman. He ran the stores, he ran the people, he stood and he talked. Time magazine put them on the cover in 1950 and wrote that if you asked anyone at A&P to name the 2 men who seemed least likely to agree on anything, you would get George and John Hartford. One is thin and the other is plump. One is bold and the other is cautious. One is gregarious and the other is shy. Both are widowers. Both live only for A&P. But there the similarity ends. Neither of them ever finished high school. Neither of them ever worked for another company. Neither of them had children. They gave their entire lives to one business, and together they turned it into the most powerful retailer the world had ever seen. In 1912, John Hartford had an idea that his father and brother both rejected. He wanted to open tiny, bare-bones stores that sold groceries at impossibly low prices. No credit, no delivery, no frills, just food, cheap. His father said no. His brother said no. John convinced them to let him try one store, just one, in Jersey City, New Jersey. He invested $3,000. The store made money immediately. Within 3 years, they had opened 1,600 of them, 864 in 1915 alone. That was the birth of the discount grocery store, the idea that Sam Walton would copy 50 years later and turn into Walmart. But John Hartford did it first. By 1930, the A&P had nearly 16,000 stores in 39 states. Annual sales were the equivalent of $43 billion in today's money. They captured 25% of the grocery market in the areas where they operated and 10% of every dollar spent on food in the entire country. They were twice as big as Sears, which was the number 2 retailer. They were the largest retailer in the world, and they would hold that position for 35 years. They owned their own bakeries, their own coffee roasting plants, their own canneries, and their own dairy farms. Half of their profit came from products they manufactured themselves. Time wrote that next to General Motors, A&P sold more goods than any other company on earth. John Hartford told the magazine, "I do not know any grocer who wants to stay small. I do not see how any businessman can limit his growth and stay healthy." The United States government heard that and decided to make them stop. In 1942, the federal government criminally charged the Hartford brothers and several A&P executives with conspiring to violate the Sherman Antitrust Act. The accusation was extraordinary. They were not charged with price gouging, they were not charged with fraud, they were charged with making food too cheap. The prosecutors argued that because A&P manufactured its own products and sold them in its own stores and cut out the wholesalers, the company had an unfair advantage that smaller grocers could not compete with. A federal judge in Illinois found them guilty in 1946. George Hartford was 81 years old. John was 74. The judge acknowledged in his ruling that selling nearly $2 billion worth of food at a profit of 1.5 cents on each dollar was an achievement one may well be proud of, and then he convicted them anyway. The government wanted to break A&P into 7 separate companies. Thousands of ordinary Americans wrote letters to the Justice Department defending the store where they bought their food. The case dragged on until the Eisenhower administration quietly dropped it in 1953. But the damage was done. The brothers became cautious, the company slowed down, and time was running out. John Hartford passed away in 1951. His brother George died in 1957 at 93 years old. They left their fortunes to charity. They left the company to professional managers who had none of their instinct and none of their vision. And they left behind a fatal problem that would take decades to finish what the government could not. Neither brother had children. There was no next generation of Hartfords. No one had grown up in the business. No one understood in their bones what the company was and what it needed to become. What it needed to become was suburban. After the war, America moved to the suburbs. Millions of families left the cities for houses with yards and driveways, and they needed big new supermarkets with large parking lots close to where they now lived. Every major grocery chain saw this and followed the customers. A&P did not. They stayed in their old city locations with their small stores, their short-term leases, their wooden floors, and their narrow aisles. One historian wrote that A&P was running 5 to 10 years behind the migratory patterns of its own customers. By the time they started building suburban stores, it was too late. The competition had already taken the best locations. Kroger, Safeway, Winn-Dixie, they were all smaller than A&P, but they were in the right places and A&P was not. The decline lasted 50 years. That is what makes it so painful. This was not a company that collapsed overnight. It was a company that everyone watched slowly disappear, decade after decade, while nobody could figure out how to stop it. They lost the #1 position in 1975 after holding it for 60 straight years. A German retail family called the Haubs bought a majority stake and tried to modernize. It did not work. They sold off their Canadian stores. They sold 8 O'Clock Coffee, the brand that had been the soul of the company since the 1880s, for roughly $150 million. It was the last thing A&P manufactured. When it was gone, there was nothing left of the company that the Hartford brothers had built, just stores, and not very good ones. In 2007, they bought their rival Pathmark and took on enormous debt to do it. The timing could not have been worse. The recession hit the following year. Customers left for cheaper options. In December of 2010, A&P filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. They came out of it in 2012 as a private company, briefly profitable, but they could not find a buyer. In July of 2015, they filed for bankruptcy a second time. By November 25th of that year, every remaining A&P store in America was closed or sold to someone else. The name that had been on the front of grocery stores since before the Civil War was gone, 156 years. From a tea shop on Vesey Street in Manhattan to nearly 16,000 stores to nothing. From a company so dominant that the federal government tried to break it apart to a company so weak that nobody wanted to buy it. From two brothers who could not have been more different, but who together created something no one had ever seen before, to a boardroom full of executives who could not agree on anything and built nothing that lasted. You cannot buy 8 O'Clock Coffee at an A&P anymore. You can still buy the brand. It is on the shelf at other supermarkets in a bag that looks almost the same, but it does not taste the same. That is not nostalgia talking. The people who drank it for 40 years will tell you that. Something changed when it left the red grinder at the front of the store. Something about the way the beans were roasted specifically for that machine and ground right there in front of you while you waited. You cannot replicate that in a factory and ship it in a truck and put it on a shelf at a store that had nothing to do with making it. The coffee needs the store, and the store needs the coffee, and without each other, neither one is what it was. Somewhere in your memory there is a smell. It is not just coffee, it is coffee and fresh bread and sawdust and cold air from the meat counter and paper bags and something else underneath all of it that you can only describe as the way a grocery store is supposed to smell. It is your mother's hand on yours walking through the door. It is the cashier counting change into your palm. It is the butcher in the white coat giving you a slice of something when nobody was looking. It is the sound of the grinder and the feel of the brown paper bag in your arms and the weight of it against your chest as you carried it to the car. That is the A&P, not the company, not the stock price, not the bankruptcy filing, the store, your store, the one your family went to every single week for 20 or 30 or 40 years until one day it was not there anymore and nothing that replaced it ever smelled the same. If your mother shopped at the A&P, tell me about it. If you remember the coffee grinder and the sound it made, tell me what it sounded like. If you were the kid she sent in alone with a list on the back of an envelope and a few dollars folded in your pocket, tell me about the first time. I read every single comment.